The Harley-Davidson shovelhead rumbled like distant thunder across the flat expanse of Texas Panhandle, its chrome-catching afternoon sun in blinding flashes. Four more machines followed in tight formation, their engines creating a symphony of controlled power that rolled across the emptiness like a promise, or a warning. The lead rider sat low in the saddle, leather vest pulled tight against wind that carried the smell of dust and creosote, his eyes hidden behind aviator sunglasses that had seen better decades. Griffin Maddox kept his speed steady at 65 and exactly 10 miles over the posted limit, fast enough to feel alive, but not fast enough to give small-town sheriffs an excuse to pull over five bikers riding through their jurisdiction. Route 66 stretched ahead like a faded memory of America's better days. The asphalt cracked and patched so many times it resembled scar tissue. Billboards advertised motels that had closed during the Carter administration, their paint peeling in strips that flapped when 18-wheelers blasted past. The Iron Shepherd's Motorcycle Club didn't mind the decay. They'd seen worse. They'd been worse. Griff raised his left-hand fingers, pointing toward an exit ramp a quarter-mile ahead. The gesture was precise, economical, learned from 4 years as military police in West Germany, where communication had to be silent and absolute. Behind him, Dax Hartley on the cherry-red Sportster acknowledged with a brief nod, passing the signal back through the line. They'd been riding together since 1980, and by now the choreography was instinctive. 5 men, 5 bikes moving as one organism across America's forgotten highways. The exit led to a 2-lane county road that hadn't seen fresh paint since Reagan's first term. A sun-bleached sign announced Redstone, Texas, population 1-200, though someone had spray painted over the number with "Who cares" in dripping letters. Griff almost smiled. Small-town anger looked the same everywhere, whether it was Germany or Texas, whether it came from kids with too much time or adults with too little hope. The Shepherds had seen it in 15 towns across 3 states, and they'd learned not to take it personally. Anger was just fear, wearing a different jacket. Ruby's Diner sat at the intersection of the county road and what passed for Main Street, a long rectangular building clad in aluminum siding that had oxidized to the color of old nickels. The neon sign in the window buzzed and flickered, missing half its letters, so it read "Rub Dye." Someone had taped cardboard over the gaps, but the attempt at repair only made it sadder. The parking lot was mostly empty except for 3 pickup trucks and a Buick that might have been white before the dust claimed it. Griff pulled his shovelman head into a space near the door, positioning the bike so he could see both entrances and the road. Old habits died hard. Old habits kept you alive. The others parked in a loose semicircle, engines dying one by one until the sudden silence felt almost aggressive. Griff swung his leg over the saddle and stretched, joints popping. 38 years old, and his body kept reminding him that standing guard in the cold for 4 years had left deposits of stiffness that would never fully dissolve. Dax was already off his bike, running a hand through red hair that was going gray at the temples, despite him being only 28. The kid had been a combat engineer at Fort Hood, trained to build bridges and blow them up with equal efficiency, but he'd never deployed. The Army had spent 2 years teaching him to destroy things, then discharged him in 1982 when budget cuts hit and they decided peacetime didn't need as many people who knew how to make buildings fall down. Reyes Martinez locked his lowrider and adjusted the leather cut he wore over a black t-shirt. At 30, he moved with the careful precision of someone who'd spent his military years sitting at a desk in Maryland, monitoring Soviet radio traffic and building profiles of KGB officers he'd never meet. Army intelligence had taught him to see patterns in chaos, to find the signal in the noise, but it hadn't prepared him for the quiet disappointment of coming home to find that nobody cared about his work because the war he'd prepared for had never arrived. Coda Blackbear took his time dismounting the wide glide, checking the saddlebags with the methodical attention that came from 5 years as an Army medic. His Cherokee grandfather had taught him that haste was disrespect, and the military had reinforced the lesson differently. In a field hospital, rushing meant mistakes, and mistakes meant body bags. At 35, Coda had steady hands and patient eyes, though his mouth rarely moved toward a smile. He'd spent his service years at VA hospitals, from San Antonio to El Paso, patching up soldiers who'd served in Vietnam and Korea, hearing their stories about combat, while knowing his own service would never include those chapters. Marcus Webb was the last one off his bike, the Electroglide still ticking as metal cooled. At 40, he was the oldest of the group, and the only one who'd never worn the uniform full-time, though his National Guard weekends had taught him enough about military discipline to understand what the others had lost when they'd transitioned back to civilian life. He wore a sheriff deputy's badge from Coleman County, and his presence in the Shepherds was technically complicated by his law enforcement status, but Marcus had decided years ago that protecting people mattered more than departmental policy. Besides, the Iron Shepherds had never broken laws that mattered. They'd broken plenty of noses, but that was different. The five of them stood in loose formation, reading the space the way soldiers and cops always do. Two exits, four vehicles that meant at least four people inside windows, positioned so you couldn't see the entire interior from outside. The diner had been built in the 1950s when Americans trusted each other more, or at least pretended to, but time and experience had added bars to the windows and extra locks to the doors. Griff could see the alarm company sticker near the handle, yellowed and peeling. Whatever security system had been installed was probably disconnected, now another monthly bill the owner couldn't justify. The bell above the door chimed when they entered, a bright sound that contrasted with the wary silence that greeted them. Two truckers at the counter looked up, evaluated, decided these bikers weren't their problem. An elderly man in the corner booth kept his eyes on his coffee. A waitress behind the counter froze mid-pour the coffee pot, suspended in space like she'd forgotten what she was doing. She was 65 if she was a day gray. Her hair pulled back in a style that had been practical in 1952 and remained practical now. Her name tag said Ruby in faded red letters. Her eyes said she'd seen things and survived them and wasn't particularly impressed by five men in leather. Griff pulled off his sunglasses and met her stare. 3 seconds of mutual assessment past the kind of silent negotiation that happened 1,000 times a day in America but nobody talked about. Finally, Ruby's mouth quirked. "Won't bite if you don't. We don't bite." Griff moved toward the counter, the others following. "Just need coffee and whatever's edible." Ruby set down the pot and pulled 5 menus from behind the register. Her hands were steady knuckles, swollen from arthritis, but still capable. She dealt the menus like cards, one in front of each stool. Meatloaf's fresh, pie's not, coffee's hot. Dax grinned. "Sounds like every diner in Texas." "That's because it's true in every diner in Texas." Ruby's voice carried the flat pragmatism of someone who'd outlived 2 husbands in a decade of bad decisions. "You boys passing through or looking for trouble?" "Just passing through." Marcus spoke up, his deputy training giving him a natural authority. "We're the Iron Shepherds. We help people who need it, don't bother people who don't." Ruby considered this. "I've heard of you. You're the ones who helped that family in Lubbock when their barn burned down. Built them a new one in 3 days. That was us." Reyes accepted the coffee Ruby poured. "We know construction, and you're the ones who ran off those meth dealers in Amarillo." Ruby's eyes were sharp now, reassessing. "Sheriff said you did in 2 hours what his department couldn't do in 6 months. The dealers decided to relocate." Griff sipped his coffee, which was hot and bitter, and exactly what his system needed. "We provided motivation." Ruby smiled, and it changed her whole face. She'd been pretty once, probably beautiful before life had worn down the edges. "I like motivation. What brings motivated men to Redstone?" "Just the road." Coda spoke quietly, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone who thought before speaking. "We go where we're needed, and if nobody needs you, then we drink coffee until they do." The bell chimed again. A woman entered, moving with the kind of careful deliberation that came from knowing the world was watching and judging. She was 27, dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that revealed a face both striking and guarded. Her clothes were cheap, but clean jeans and a white t-shirt that had been washed so many times the fabric had gone translucent at the elbows. She carried a single backpack, the kind soldiers use for 3-day passes, and her eyes swept the diner with the same tactical assessment Griff had performed 3 minutes earlier. "Ruby, I'm here." The woman's voice carried a slight accent, Eastern European, maybe carefully buried under layers of Americanization, but still audible to anyone who knew how to listen. "Sorry I'm late. Bus took longer than expected." "You're not late, you're early." Ruby pulled out an apron from under the counter. "Shift doesn't start for 20 minutes. You got a place to stay yet?" "Working on it." The woman tied the apron with practiced efficiency. "The motel down the street if they'll take weekly." "They will. Tell them I sent you." Ruby turned back to the Shepherds. "This is Lyra. Started yesterday. She's a hard worker, so don't give her trouble." "Yes, ma'am." Griff nodded, but his attention stayed on Lyra as she moved behind the counter and began checking inventory with the kind of systematic thoroughness that spoke of training. The way she moved, the way she'd scan the room, the way her hands stayed visible and ready. Military or intelligence or something in that family. He'd seen it too many times not to recognize the signs. Lyra felt his attention and met his eyes. For a second, something flickered there. Recognition, maybe, or fear, or calculation. Then it was gone, replaced by the neutral pleasantness of a waitress who needed tips. "What can I get you, gentlemen? 5 meatloaves." Dax leaned back on his stool. "And pie if it's actually good, no matter what the boss says." Ruby swatted him with a dish towel. "Pie's from yesterday. Still good. Then pie." Dax's grin was infectious. "Life's too short for old pie, but we'll make an exception." Lyra wrote down the order, her handwriting small and precise. The way she held the pen fingers positioned for speed and efficiency reminded Griff of the intelligence reports he'd filed during his MP days. Everything about her was controlled, measured, designed to avoid attention while still accomplishing the mission, whatever her mission was. The food arrived 15 minutes later, and it was better than expected. Ruby had been cooking since Eisenhower was president, and her meatloaf carried the weight of tradition and competence. The shepherds ate in companionable silence, the kind of quiet that came from years of riding together, sleeping in the same camps, watching each other's backs in situations that ranged from awkward to genuinely dangerous. They'd formed the club in 1983, 5 men sitting in a VA hospital in San Antonio, comparing notes on how it felt to train for wars that never came to build skills that peacetime didn't value, to return home and find that nobody knew what to do with them. Griff had been the one to suggest the motorcycles. He'd seen the clubs in Germany, the way men who'd lost purpose found it again, in the simple act of riding in the brotherhood that formed when you trusted someone else to watch the road while you watched theirs. The others had agreed immediately, sensing the same void in themselves. They'd pooled their discharge pay and bought the bikes used, spent 6 months learning maintenance and road protocol, then started riding with no particular destination in mind. The purpose had found them in Lubbock when they'd stopped for Gippon and found a family whose barn had burned down 2 nights before. The father had been a veteran, and he'd looked at their cuts with the same mixture of hope and suspicion that Griff had seen in Ruby's eyes. The shepherds had stayed for 3 days, using Dax's engineering knowledge and Marcus's construction connections to rebuild the structure. The family had tried to pay them, but Griff had refused. This wasn't about money. It was about proving they still had value. After Lubbock, the calls had started coming. Quiet requests from veterans networks, from churches, from sheriffs who had problems that didn't fit neatly into legal categories. The shepherds never advertised, never sought attention, but word spread the way it always does in communities that rely on trust more than institutions. They'd helped a dozen families in 2 years, and they'd never taken a dime. Donations came sometimes, and they accepted those because turning down generosity felt like disrespect, but payment for services felt wrong. This wasn't a business. It was a calling they'd stumbled into. Griff paid the bill and left a 30% tip, watching Lyra's eyes widen slightly when she saw the amount. She nodded her thanks but didn't speak already, moving to clear another table. Professional, efficient, scared. He caught her wrist as she passed his grip, gentle but insistent. "If you need help, we help people." Lyra went very still, and for a heartbeat, Griff thought she might bolt. Then she looked down at his hand, at the scars on his knuckles from too many fights in too many German bars, and something in her expression shifted. "I'm fine." Her voice was steady, but the slight tremor in her pulse betrayed her. "Thank you for the offer." Griff released her and pulled a card from his vest pocket. Plain white, no logo, just a phone number written in permanent marker. "If that changes, call, day or night." She took the card, studied it, slipped it into her apron pocket. "I appreciate it." The shepherds left the diner and stood in the parking lot, letting the heat settle over them like a blanket. August in Texas was an endurance test, the kind of weather that made you understand why people had fought wars over air conditioning. Griff squinted at the sun, calculating hours until dark. We staying Dax already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. One night, Griff swung onto his shovelhead. "Something's wrong with her." "Yeah." Marcus started his electroglide. "Question is whether it's our kind of wrong, only one way to find out." They found a campsite 2 miles outside town, a flat stretch of nothing that sat far enough from the road to provide privacy, but close enough to reach the diner in 3 minutes if speed mattered. The shepherds set up camp with the efficiency of practice 5 tents arranged in a defensive perimeter with the bikes parked at the center. The formation was based on fire-based layouts Griff had studied during his MP training, designed so that anyone approaching from any direction would be visible to at least 2 positions. Paranoid maybe, but paranoia had kept them alive through situations that could have gone sideways. Dax built a fire using mesquite wood he'd collected from a dead tree, and soon the smell of burning wood mixed with the scent of coffee percolating in an old enamel pot. Coda distributed MREs from his saddlebag, the meals ready to eat that civilians complained about, but soldiers learned to appreciate because they meant you weren't hungry. Reyes set up a small radio tuning through static until he found a station playing Willie Nelson, and the music floated across the campsite like a benediction. We should talk about the girl. Marcus sat on a camp stool, his deputy instincts kicking in. She's running from something. Obviously. Reyes tore open his MRE and examined the contents without enthusiasm. Question is what? Domestic situation, criminal past, or something else? The accent bothers me. Griff poked the fire with a stick, sending sparks spiraling into the darkening sky. Eastern European. Could be Russian, Ukrainian, Polish. Hard to tell when someone's working to hide it. You think she's illegal? Dax looked up sharply. Because if immigration's involved, we need to be careful. Marcus can't be seen helping someone dodge federal warrants. She's not illegal. Coda spoke with the certainty of someone who'd spent years reading body language in emergency rooms. She's trained, military or intelligence. The way she moved, the way she assessed threats. That's not civilian behavior. So what's a trained operative doing working as a waitress in Redstone, Texas? Marcus frowned. That's not a career move. It's a hiding move. Griff set down his stick and looked at each of them in turn. She's running from something big enough that she had to go completely dark. Change her life, change her location, probably changed her name too. And we're considering getting involved. Dax's voice carried no judgment, just clarification. Even though we don't know what we'd be getting involved in, that's the job. Reyes smiled without humor. We help people who fall through the cracks. She's definitely in a crack. Marcus stood and walked to his bike, pulled out the CB radio handset. Let me make some calls. See if anything's come across official channels about missing persons or fugitives matching her description. While Marcus worked the radio, the others sat around the fire and watched the stars emerge. Out here, away from city lights, the Milky Way sprawled across the sky like spilled sugar. Griff had seen these same stars from Germany, and they'd looked exactly the same, which had bothered him in ways he'd never been able to articulate. The universe didn't care about borders or politics or the little dramas humans created. It just turned indifferent and eternal. Nothing. Marcus returned 20 minutes later, his expression troubled. No bolo matching her description, no warrants, no missing person reports. But I called a buddy at DPS and he said something interesting. FBI has been running quiet inquiries through Texas law enforcement asking about any sightings of Soviet nationals or Eastern European refugees. No details, just watch and report. Soviet nationals. Reyes sat up straighter. In 1985, that's not immigration. That's intelligence. Or defection. Coda refilled his coffee cup. Someone who ran from the USSR would need to hide. They'd have KGB looking for them on one side and CIA handling them on the other. If she slipped through those cracks somehow, she'd be completely alone. Unless she had help. Griff stared into the fire. Unless someone was actively hiding her. Who hides a Soviet defector in Redstone, Texas? Dax shook his head. This isn't exactly a hotbed of international intrigue. That's exactly why you'd hide someone here. Marcus's deputy training was showing. You don't hide someone in a big city where intelligence services have resources. You hide them in a place so small and unremarkable that nobody would think to look. They sat with that for a while, each of them processing the implications. Getting involved with someone connected to Cold War intelligence was several steps beyond their normal operations. The Shepherds had dealt with domestic violence, property crimes, local corruption. They'd never touched anything that might involve federal agencies or foreign governments. We should walk away. Marcus said it quietly without conviction. This is above our pay grade. We don't have a pay grade. Dax smiled. We're volunteers, you know what I mean. If she's connected to Soviet intelligence, helping her could put us in federal crosshairs. aiding and abetting obstruction, maybe even espionage charges if they want to stretch. And if we walk away and she ends up dead, Griff didn't raise his voice, but everyone heard the weight behind the words. If we had the chance to help and we decided it was too complicated, too risky, too far outside our comfort zone. The silence stretched. Reyes poked the fire. Dax examined his hands. Coda looked at the stars. Marcus closed his eyes. Finally, Griff continued, his voice carrying across the campfire like judgment. 1982. I was 4,000 miles from home, standing guard duty. That meant nothing. My sister called 3 times that week. I was too busy, too important, always planning to call her back tomorrow. There was no tomorrow. Her boyfriend's fists made sure of that. By the time neighbors stopped pretending they didn't hear her screaming, Sarah had been bleeding out on her kitchen floor for 2 hours. He paused, staring into flames that cast shadows across his face. Every person who heard and did nothing, every neighbor who decided it wasn't their business, every friend who saw the bruises and said nothing, they all killed her as surely as the man who threw the punches. I wasn't there to save her, but I can be here now. For Lyra, for anyone. We know, Coda's voice was gentle. You've told us. I'm telling you again because I need you to understand. Griff met each man's eyes. Feeling guilty about Sarah doesn't mean we should risk federal prison. But it means I can't walk away from someone who might need protection. And you all joined this club knowing that's what we do. Another silence, longer this time. The fire crackled. Willie Nelson gave way to Waylon Jennings on the radio. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled. We should vote. Reyes stood up, assuming his role as the club's unofficial secretary. Official Iron Shepherd's business requires unanimous consent. We all agree, or we walk away? Agreed. Griff looked around the circle. All in favor of staying in Redstone, monitoring the situation with Lyra and offering protection if she needs it, knowing this might involve federal complications. Dax raised his hand first. I'm in. We didn't form this club to play it safe. Coda raised his next. I took an oath to help people. Didn't specify which people. Reyes raised his own hand. Someone's got to be the good guys. That left Marcus. The deputy sat very still, working through calculations that involved his badge, his pension, his future. Then he raised his hand. I'll probably regret this, but I'd regret walking away more. Unanimous. Griff felt something loosen in his chest. We stay, we watch, we wait, and if she needs us, we're ready. The next morning arrived with the kind of brutal clarity that only high desert sunrise can deliver. Griff was awake before dawn, when old habits pulling him from sleep at 0500, even though he had nowhere to be and nothing scheduled. He started coffee and woke the others, and by 0600 they were packed and ready to ride into town. Ruby's diner opened at 6, and the Shepherds wanted to be there when Lyra arrived for her shift. They took the same table in the corner, positioning themselves so they could see both entrances and the counter. Ruby served them coffee and didn't comment on their return, which Griff appreciated. The woman was smart enough to recognize protection detail when she saw it. Lyra arrived at 0545, 15 minutes early, and her eyes went immediately to the Shepherds. Something flickered across her face, too quick to read, then vanished behind professional neutrality. She tied her apron and began prep work, but Griff noticed the way her hands shook slightly when she thought nobody was watching. The morning passed quietly. Truckers came and went. Local ranchers stopped in for breakfast and gossip. An elderly couple celebrated their anniversary with pancakes and held hands across the table. Normal small-town rhythms, the kind of peaceful mundanity that made Griff remember why he'd joined the military in the first place. Protection wasn't about fighting. It was about preserving spaces where people could hold hands over pancakes. Then at 10:47, the door slammed open hard enough to rattle the blinds. The man who stumbled through was 28, drunk, despite the hour, and radiating the kind of aggressive entitlement that came from never facing consequences. His clothes were expensive, but disheveled, his hair styled in a way that suggested someone had paid money to make it look casually perfect. His eyes were bloodshot and unfocused, but they locked onto Lyra with the intensity of a predator recognizing prey. Well, 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 his words slurred together, vowels bleeding into consonants. If it isn't my favorite little waitress. Lyra froze the coffee pot suspended in her hand. Her face went carefully blank, but Griff could see her pulse hammering in her throat. We're not open for service right now, sir. Her voice stayed level, professional. Please come back in an hour. Don't tell me what to do. The man grabbed the edge of a table to steady himself. You think you're better than me? You're just a waitress in a dead-end diner in a dead-end town. Please leave. Lyra set down the coffee pot, her hand sliding toward her apron pocket. I don't want trouble. Too late. The man started around the counter. You think you can tell me no? You know who my father is? Griff was already moving his body, reacting before his brain finished processing the threat assessment. He covered the distance in 4 strides and put himself between the drunk and Lyra. His posture relaxed, but his weight balanced for action. Time to go. Griff kept his voice calm, the MP tone that had diffused 100 bar fights in Germany. Sleep it off. Come back tomorrow. Apologize. The drunk's eyes focused on Griff with difficulty. Who the hell are you? Someone who's leaving. Griff gestured toward the door. Same as you. I'm not going anywhere. The drunk tried to push past Griff, his coordination gone, but his determination intact. That bitch needs to learn respect. 2 things happened simultaneously. The drunk's hands shot out toward Lyra's throat fast despite the alcohol. And Lyra moved. Her response was pure reflex-trained reaction, overriding conscious thought. She pivoted inside the drunk's reach, used his momentum against him, and executed a textbook wrist lock that sent him stumbling backward. The technique was Sistema, the Russian martial art taught to Spetsnaz soldiers, and Griff recognized it instantly because he'd seen Soviet embassy guards practice the same moves in Berlin. The drunk crashed into a table, sending plates and silverware exploding in every direction. He lay there gasping confusion, replacing aggression as his alcohol-soaked brain tried to process what had just happened. Behind the counter, Lyra stood frozen, her training exposed her cover blown. Griff looked at her. She looked back. Understanding passed between them in a single instant of absolute clarity. Then Dax was there, lifting the drunk by his collar, and Marcus was pulling out his deputy badge, and Coda was checking for injuries. And Reyes was already on his phone calling the local sheriff. Ruby stood behind the counter, arms crossed, looking more annoyed than surprised. That's Vince Hale Jr. His daddy owns half this town. You boys just made a powerful enemy. We've made worse. Griff kept his eyes on Lyra, who was breathing too fast, her carefully constructed identity crumbling around her. Ma'am, I need you to come with us. Right now. I can't. Lyra's voice cracked. If I run, they'll know. They'll find me faster. They already know. Griff moved closer, pitching his voice low enough that only she could hear. That Spetsnaz technique you just used. That's not something you learn at the Y. Whoever you're hiding from, they'll hear about this within an hour. You need protection, and we're offering. Why would you help me? Lyra's eyes were wide now, fear replacing caution. You don't know who I am. What I've done, don't care. Griff held out his hand. We help people who need it, that's all. For a long moment, Lyra didn't move. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, she reached out and took his hand. Outside, sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. The sheriff's cruiser rolled into Ruby's parking lot with its lights off, which told Griff everything he needed to know about how this would play. Deputy Marcus Webb stood at parade rest near the door, his own badge visible on his belt, creating a buffer between local law enforcement and the 5 bikers who'd just thrown Vincent Hale Jr. into a table. The arriving officer was 50-something, soft around the middle, in the way cops get when they spend 20 years driving instead of walking, and his eyes went immediately to Marcus, with the kind of relief that came from finding an ally in a complicated situation. Tom Briggs, Redstone Sheriff. The older man extended his hand to Marcus, first ignoring the others. Heard we had an incident. Drunken, disorderly assault attempt on staff. Marcus kept his voice neutral, professional. 5 witnesses, including myself. Mr. Hale initiated contact. Waitress defended herself. Situation was controlled without excessive force. Sheriff Briggs looked past Marcus at Vince Jr., who was sitting on the diner floor with Dax standing over him like a red-bearded guardian angel. The young man's expensive shirt was torn, his carefully styled hair now pointing in directions that suggested gravity had opinions, and his face carried the expression of someone who'd just discovered the world didn't revolve around him after all. Vince, you want to press charges against these men, Vince. Junior's mouth opened, then closed. His alcohol-clouded brain was starting to process reality, and reality included 5 bikers who looked like they'd forgotten more about violence than he'd ever learned, plus a deputy from another county who was radiating the kind of calm authority that suggested arguing would be counterproductive. No charges. The words came out sullen, defeated. Just want to go home. Then go. Sheriff Briggs stepped aside, creating a path to the door. Sleep it off. We'll talk tomorrow about the assault complaint this young lady's going to file. I'm not filing anything. Lyra's voice cut across the diner, sharp and immediate. No complaint, no paperwork, no police report. Just let him leave. The sheriff turned, surprised. Ma'am, he put hands on you. That's assault in Texas. You have every right to press charges. I don't want to. Lyra's accent thickened slightly under stress, the Eastern European vowels pushing through her American veneer. Please, just let him go. Griff understood immediately what she was doing. Police reports meant documentation. Documentation meant her name entering systems, and systems meant someone somewhere might notice. She was trading justice for invisibility, choosing safety over satisfaction, and the desperation in that choice made his chest tighten. Sheriff Briggs studied Lyra for a long moment, and Griff could see the man's cop instincts warring with his political realities. Vince Hale Jr.'s father owned the bank that held the mortgage on half the county, including probably the sheriff's house. Pursuing charges without the victim's cooperation would be difficult and career-limiting. The path of least resistance was obvious. If that's your choice, ma'am. The sheriff pulled out a business card and handed it to Lyra. You change your mind, call me direct. Doesn't matter how much time passes. Vince Jr. stumbled toward the door, and Griff noticed the way his hand went to his phone fingers, moving with more coordination than his feet. Making a call, probably to Daddy, definitely a problem for later. After the sheriff left, Ruby locked the front door and flipped the sign to closed. She moved behind the counter and started making fresh coffee with the deliberate calm of someone who'd survived worse days than this. You boys want to tell me what's really going on? She didn't look up from the coffee pot, because that girl's more scared of police reports than she is of drunk idiots. And you, Favo, are acting like this is a military operation instead of a diner fight. Can't tell you what we don't know. Griff settled onto a stool, but we're trying to find out. Ruby finished with the coffee and turned to face them, and her expression carried the weight of 6 decades lived hard. I was married to a Marine. Buried him in 1968 after the Tet Offensive turned him into a name on a wall. I've seen men who came home from war, and I've seen men who came home but left pieces of themselves over there. You 5, you've got that look. Like you're still deployed even though nobody's shooting. We served during peacetime. Marcus accepted the coffee Ruby poured. Trained for wars that never came. That's its own kind of loss. Ruby poured for the others. And that girl, she's got the same look. Like she's on deployment in a country that doesn't know it's a battlefield. Lyra sat at the far end of the counter, her hands wrapped around a mug, her eyes distant. I should leave. Take a bus tonight, go somewhere else, start over again. How many times you started over? Coda's voice was gentle, the medic in him recognizing trauma. How many towns, how many names? Too many. Lyra's laugh was bitter. I've been running for 18 months. Different cities, different jobs, always moving before anyone asked questions. I thought Redstone would be safe. Small enough to hide and quiet enough that nobody would look. But someone's looking. Reyes leaned forward. Whoever you're running from, they're professionals. They'll hear about what happened today. Your technique, the way you move, that tells a story to people who know how to read it. Lyra closed her eyes. My name is Lyra Volkov. My father was Dr. Nikolai Volkov, senior physicist at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Do you know what he worked on Soviet space program? Griff felt pieces clicking together in his mind. Missile guidance, satellite technology, weapons research, particle beam weapons. Lyra opened her eyes and they were full of something that looked like grief. Strategic Defense Initiative, the Americans call it. Star Wars. Reagan thinks it's science fiction, but my father made it real. He developed a weapon that could shoot down any ICBM before it left Soviet airspace. Not just shoot it down, but vaporize it completely. No fallout, no debris. Perfect defense. The implications settled over the diner like fallout themselves. Perfect defense meant mutually assured destruction collapsed. It meant one side could launch nuclear war without fear of retaliation. It meant the delicate balance of terror that had kept the Cold War cold for 40 years would evaporate. That weapon can't exist. Marcus spoke quietly. If the Soviets had that capability, they'd already have used the leverage. They'd have won the Cold War by now. They don't have it. Lyra's hands shook coffee slopping over the rim of her mug. My father took the blueprints with him when he defected in 1983. He brought them to the CIA, told them everything offered to help America build their own version. He thought he was doing the right thing. He thought America would use the technology for peace. What happened? Dax already knew the answer, but he asked anyway. CIA killed him. Lyra's voice went flat, emotionless, the tone of someone who'd said these words so many times they'd lost their power to hurt. Made it look like a car accident in Virginia near the safe house where they'd hidden him. I was visiting from college, drove up just as they were cleaning the scene. Saw the agent who'd been running my father's debriefing, standing there watching, and I knew. Saw it in his face. This wasn't an accident. Why would CIA kill their own asset? Rhea's intelligence training was showing his mind already building frameworks. They'd want the technology. They'd want everything he knew. That's exactly why they killed him. Lyra pulled something from her pocket, a small cylindrical object about the size of a prescription medication pen. My father had diabetes, took insulin daily. This is his insulin pen, except it's not. She twisted the cap, and instead of a needle, a tiny scroll of microfilm emerged. The film was so small, Griff could barely see details, but Lyra handled it with the reverence people usually reserve for religious relics. The complete blueprints. Everything needed to build the particle beam weapon condensed into 16 frames of microfilm. My father gave CIA the first half of the design during his debriefing, but he held this back. Insurance. He told me where it was hidden in case anything happened to him. When they killed him, I took it and ran. Why run? Marcus frowned. Why not give it to FBI, Justice Department, Congress if CIA murdered a defector that's massive? Because the agent who killed my father is Deputy Director Richard Kane. Lyra's voice hardened. And Kane doesn't work for America. He works for defense contractors who make billions from Cold War tensions. If the particle beam weapon exists, if it actually works, the whole military-industrial complex collapses. No more ICBM contracts, no more strategic bomber programs, no more tens of billions in annual defense spending. Kane killed my father to protect that money, and he'll kill me to make sure the second half of the blueprint stays buried. The diner went silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the tick of Ruby's old clock. Outside, Texas sun beat down on asphalt, and somewhere in the distance a dog barked and the world continued spinning, indifferent to the revelation that had just dropped into it. Griff stood and walked to the window, his mind working through scenarios. He'd spent 4 years in military police learning threat assessment and protective protocols, and every bit of that training was screaming that this situation was several steps beyond the shepherd's capability. Protecting someone from domestic violence or local criminals was one thing. Protecting someone from CIA black operations was something else entirely. But the alternative was walking away, and Sarah's face rose in his memory, and he knew he couldn't do that. We need 72 hours, he turned back to the group. 3 days to find someone in Washington who's clean, who we can trust with this information. Someone with enough authority to protect Lyra and investigate Kane. That's a fantasy. Lyra shook her head. Kane's been deputy director for 8 years. He's got people everywhere, connections in every agency. There's nobody clean enough and powerful enough to take him on. There might be. Reyes pulled out a small notebook, the kind intelligence analysts carried everywhere. When I was at Fort Meade, I worked with a liaison officer from Army Intelligence, Captain James Holland. He rotated out in 1982, but I heard he went to work for Senate Intelligence Committee. If anyone has access to investigate CIA without CIA knowing it's someone with congressional authority, can you reach him? Griff felt something like hope stirring. I can try. Reyes was already moving toward his bike. I'll need to make calls from a payphone. Can't risk anything traceable. While Reyes worked his contacts, the others began fortifying Ruby's diner. It wasn't a conscious decision, more like instinct, taking over 5 men with military training, recognizing that they were about to defend a position against unknown hostiles with unknown capabilities. Dax surveyed the building structure, noting the concrete foundation and aluminum siding that would stop small arms fire. Marcus called his sheriff's department, taking personal leave without explaining why, which meant his badge wouldn't protect him if this went sideways, but also meant he wouldn't be compromised by departmental politics. Coda inventoried medical supplies from his saddlebag, and the collection was impressive in its thoroughness. trauma shears, Israeli bandages, quick clot gauze, chest seals, tourniquets. The man had been carrying a mobile trauma kit on his motorcycle for 2 years, and Griff had never questioned why, because all of them carried pieces of their military lives into civilian space. Ruby watched them work with the expression of someone who'd seen soldiers prepare for combat before and recognized the rituals. You boys really think someone's coming. Someone's definitely coming. Griff checked the windows, noting sightlines and approach vectors. Question is who and when. Could be local law enforcement on Hale's payroll. Could be CIA contractors Kane sends in. Could be both. And you five are planning to stop them. Ruby's voice carried skepticism, but not mockery. 5 bikers against federal agencies. 5 bikers with nothing to lose. Dax looked up from the plans he was sketching. We trained for this even if we never got to use it. Might as well put the education to work. Reyes returned an hour later, his expression cautiously optimistic. Holland remembers me. He's now Chief of Staff for Senate Intelligence Committee, which means he has oversight authority for CIA operations. I told him we have evidence of Deputy Director Kane ordering the murder of a Soviet defector and attempting to bury weapons technology that could end the Cold War. He wants proof. We've got microfilm. Lyra held up the insulin pen. Is that enough? It's a start. Reyes pulled out a small device from his pocket, no bigger than a transistor radio. This is a portable fax machine, technically still classified, but I kept mine when I left the Army. If I can get access to a landline and a power source, I can transmit the microfilm to Holland in D.C. He'll have it analyzed by Senate intelligence staff completely outside CIA channels. How long before he can act on it? Marcus was thinking tactically now, his deputy training merging with the situation's urgency. 24 to 48 hours to verify authenticity, build a protective detail. Coordinate with Justice Department. Holland said he'd move as fast as possible, but we're talking about accusing a CIA deputy director of treason and murder. That requires bulletproof evidence and political cover. So we hold for 2 days. Griff looked around the diner, seeing it now as a defensive position. Ruby, I need you to close the diner. Tell anyone who asks that you're doing renovations. We're going to turn this place into a fortress. The transformation took 6 hours. Dax used tools from his saddlebag and materials from the local hardware store to reinforce entry points, adding deadbolts and steel bars that could be dropped into floor mounts. Marcus positioned his Electroglide so its CB radio could serve as communications hub, running an antenna up to the diner's roof for maximum range. Coda set up a medical station in the kitchen, clearing counter space, and organizing supplies with the precision of a field hospital. Reyes worked the technology angle, connecting his portable fax machine to Ruby's landline and transmitting the microfilm frame by frame to Captain Holland's secure office in Washington. The process was painfully slow, each frame taking 3 minutes to encode and transmit, but Reyes monitored every byte of data with the focus of someone who understood that communication failures could mean death. Griff walked the perimeter, his MP training engaged fully now. The diner sat at an intersection with clear sight lines in 4 directions, which meant defenders could see threats approaching, but also meant attackers could fire from multiple angles. The aluminum siding would stop handgun rounds, but not rifle fire. The windows were single-pane glass, vulnerable to breach. The front and back doors were the obvious entry points, which meant they'd need to be hardest to access. He pulled Dax aside. Can you rig early warning systems? Something that tells us if someone's approaching before they reach the building. I can do better than that. Dax's grin carried the enthusiasm of an engineer given a problem to solve. Hardware store had everything I need. Give me 2 hours. Dax worked through sunset, his combat engineer training evident in every decision. He strung fishing line across likely approach paths, attaching tin cans filled with gravel that would rattle if disturbed. He positioned road flares at strategic points, ready to be lit for illumination if power was cut. He even rigged the diner's propane tank with a remote shutoff, preventing anyone from using it as an improvised explosive. By midnight, Ruby's diner had transformed from a roadside restaurant into something resembling a forward operating base. The shepherds took turns on watch 2-hour rotations that kept everyone sharp without exhausting anyone completely. Lyra tried to help, but exhaustion claimed her around 0200, and she fell asleep in one of the booths with her head pillowed on her arms. Griff sat at the counter drinking terrible coffee and watching her sleep. In the dim emergency lighting, she looked younger than 27, more vulnerable than he'd seen her awake. Whatever training she'd received, whatever skills she possessed underneath it all, she was just someone's daughter trying to honor her father's memory while staying alive. The radio crackled. Marcus's voice came through quiet but urgent. Movement on the county road. 2 vehicles, no headlights approaching from the east. Everyone up. Griff's command snapped through the diner. Positions. The shepherds moved with practiced efficiency, each man going to his assigned station. Dax took the back door with his modified shotgun. Reyes positioned himself at a side window with Marcus's rifle. Coda stayed in the kitchen, ready to respond to casualties. Marcus remained at the CB radio, coordinating. Griff moved to the front window and watched the vehicles approach. 2 black SUVs, expensive models with tinted windows, driving slowly like they were searching for something. Or surveilling. They passed the diner, once continued down the road, then circled back. The pattern was professional, methodical, exactly what trained operators would do before initiating contact. The SUVs parked across the street, engines running. For 5 minutes, nothing happened, and the tension in the diner ratcheted higher with each passing second. Then both vehicles' doors opened simultaneously and 8 men emerged. They weren't trying to be subtle. Dark tactical clothing, visible body armor, communications gear. 2 carried rifles, the others had handguns in tactical holsters. These weren't local thugs or corrupt deputies. These were contractors, professional security personnel of the type CIA used for operations that needed plausible deniability. The leader stepped forward, pulling out a phone. 5 seconds later, Ruby's landline rang, the sound jarring in the silent diner. Griff nodded to Marcus, who picked up the receiver and hit the speaker button. A voice came through, male professional, carrying the kind of authority that assumed compliance. "This is Special Agent Carlson, Federal Bureau of Investigation. We have credible intelligence that you're harboring a fugitive wanted on espionage charges. Send out Lyra Volkov within 5 minutes and no one else will be charged." Behind him, Griff heard Lyra's sharp intake of breath. He kept his eyes on the men across the street, reading body language and positioning. The 2 with rifles had taken cover positions behind the vehicles. The others were spreading out, creating a perimeter. They were setting up for a siege, not a negotiation. Marcus spoke into the phone, his deputy training giving him credibility. "Sir, I'm Deputy Sheriff Marcus Webb, Coleman County. I'm going to need to see federal credentials before we discuss anything." A pause, then paper rustled. One of the men across the street held up a badge wallet, open to show an FBI shield. The distance was too far to verify authenticity, but the theatrical presentation suggested they expected compliance rather than scrutiny. Credentials displayed. "Now send out the fugitive." Marcus looked at Griff, who shook his head. "On what charges specifically?" "Because we're not releasing anyone without proper warrants and documentation." Another pause, longer this time. When Carlson spoke again, his voice had lost its professional veneer, revealing irritation underneath. "You're obstructing a federal investigation. That's a crime. So is unlawful detention." Marcus kept his tone level. "Produce a warrant signed by a federal judge, and we'll consider your request. Until then, everyone here is exactly where they want to be." The phone went dead. Across the street, the 8 men drew weapons. Griff's hands were steady as he picked up the CB radio handset. "Shepherd to base, we have 8 tangos in tactical gear, claiming FBI authority, but showing aggressive posture consistent with contractor rules of engagement. Request backup and witness presence." Marcus responded immediately on the CB, his deputy credentials giving him authority. "Copy, Shepherd. Notifying Coleman County Sheriff, Texas Rangers, and FBI San Antonio Field Office. Be advised, if those men are actual federal agents, they're operating outside protocol. They're not agents." Reyes was still at his window, but his voice carried certainty. FBI doesn't send tactical teams without local law enforcement coordination. These are Kane's people, probably contractors from one of the security firms CIA uses for foreign operations. Which means they'll follow contract rules of engagement. Dax checked his shotgun. Contain target, minimize witnesses, exit clean. But they won't expect resistance. Coda's voice came from the kitchen. "They think we're 5 bikers and a waitress. They don't know we're prepared. Let's keep that advantage." Griff moved away from the window, positioning himself behind the counter, where he had cover and sight lines to both entrances. "Nobody fires unless they breach. We're not starting this fight." The next 30 minutes unfolded in slow motion. The contractors across the street made calls, received instructions, repositioned twice. More vehicles arrived, 3 more SUVs, bringing the total force to 20 men. They set up proper perimeter, established fields of fire, brought out equipment that included thermal imaging and breaching charges. Inside the diner, the shepherds waited. Ruby sat in the back booth with Lyra. Both women silent, both understanding that talking would only make the waiting harder. The clock above the counter ticked toward 0300, and Griff found himself thinking about all the times he'd stood watch in Germany waiting for threats that never materialized while the real dangers happened elsewhere. Then Reyes's portable fax machine beeped. Everyone froze. Reyes moved to the device and pulled out a sheet of thermal paper, his expression transforming as he read. "It's from Holland." His voice carried disbelief. He verified the microfilm authenticity, confirmed Volkov's work is legitimate. He's briefed the Senate Intelligence Committee chair. They're issuing emergency protective custody orders for Lyra and launching immediate investigation into Deputy Director Kane. Federal marshals are en route from San Antonio with orders to secure this location and everyone in it. How long until they arrive? Marcus was already calculating. 90 minutes. Reyes checked his watch. We need to hold for 90 minutes. Across the street, the contractors were moving. 4 men approached the diner, 2 toward the front door and 2 toward the back, all carrying breaching equipment. The time for waiting was over. Griff picked up Ruby's landline and dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, he spoke clearly and loudly, knowing the call was being recorded. "This is Ruby's Diner on Highway 66, Redstone, Texas. We have armed men attempting to breach our location. We are defending ourselves under Texas self-defense statutes. Send all available law enforcement immediately." He hung up and looked at his brothers. 90 minutes. We hold for 90 minutes. Outside, the contractors began their assault. The first breaching charge detonated at 312 hours, blowing the back door off its hinges in a concussive blast that rattled every window in the diner. Dax had positioned himself 15 feet from that door behind a reinforced section of counter, and the explosion's shockwave passed over him without effect. His shotgun came up smooth and professional, not aimed at people, but at the doorframe itself, and he fired twice into the smoke-filled opening. The loads were rubber buckshot, the kind riot police use, painful and disorienting, but non-lethal. 2 contractors stumbled backward, their tactical advance disrupted by projectiles they hadn't expected. "Front door." Marcus's voice cut through the ringing in everyone's ears. 3 coming through. The front entrance hadn't been breached with explosives, just a battering ram wielded by men who thought overwhelming force would collapse resistance. They were wrong. Griff had spent 6 hours reinforcing that doorframe with steel angle iron from the hardware store, and the ram bounced off with a metallic clang that must have transmitted painful vibrations up the arms of whoever was swinging it. The contractors regrouped, switching to pry bars, working the door with methodical determination. Reyes was at the side window, his rifle aimed not at the attackers, but at their vehicles. He fired once, twice, 3 times, and across the street, headlights exploded, tires, deflated radiators, punctured. Disabling shots, strategic rather than lethal, designed to limit the contractors' mobility and escape options. The men outside scattered, seeking cover, their assault momentum broken by defenders who clearly knew what they were doing. Inside the diner, Lyra crouched behind the counter with Ruby, her hands pressed against her ears, her eyes wide with the kind of fear that came from being the reason people were shooting. Griff spared her a glance, saw the guilt and terror warring on her face, and wished he had time to tell her this wasn't her fault. But he didn't have time for anything except keeping everyone alive. The CB radio crackled. Marcus's contact at Coleman County Sheriff's Department came through, his voice tight with urgency. "Multiple units responding to your location, ETA 20 minutes. Be advised, FBI San Antonio field office reports they have no operations in Redstone tonight. Those men outside are not federal agents." "Copy that." Marcus keyed the radio, his deputy credentials giving his words weight. "Suggest you contact Texas Rangers and DPS. This is a major incident." "Already done. State police helicopter is scrambling from Amarillo. You've got air support coming." The front door finally gave way, the reinforced frame twisting under sustained assault, and 3 contractors rushed through in tactical formation. They moved well, weapons up, scanning for targets, professional in every aspect except for the fundamental error of assuming the diner's occupants would be easy prey. Griff let them get 3 steps inside before triggering the flashbang grenade Dax had rigged above the entrance. The device wasn't military grade, just road flares and black powder in a soup can, but the effect was similar. Blinding light and ear-splitting noise filled the space, and the 3 contractors stopped moving, their training momentarily overridden by sensory overload. Down. Griff's command snapped through the diner, and Kota was already moving from the kitchen with zip ties and medical training. He secured the contractors' hands behind their backs with practiced efficiency, checked them for injuries, and dragged them away from the doorway. The whole sequence took 40 seconds, and by the time the next wave of attackers tried to enter, the shepherds had already repositioned. This is insane. One of the secured contractors had recovered enough to speak, his voice carrying more confusion than anger. "You can't win this. There's 20 of us and 5 of you." Wrong math. Dax hadn't moved from his position, his shotgun still covering the back entrance. "There's 5 of us who know why we're fighting, and 20 of you who are just following orders you don't understand. That's not a fair fight." The contractor opened his mouth to respond, then closed it, perhaps realizing that arguing philosophy while zip-tied on a diner floor wasn't productive. Outside, the remaining attackers were regrouping, and Griff could see them through the broken front door, clustered behind their disabled vehicles, talking into radios, receiving instructions from whoever was coordinating this operation. Marcus monitored the CB frequency, listening to law enforcement chatter. "Sheriff's units are 5 minutes out. Texas Rangers right behind them. Someone's trying to call them off, claiming federal jurisdiction, but the local sheriff isn't buying it." Good. Griff reloaded his pistol, his movements automatic from thousands of hours of practice. "The more official witnesses we have, the harder it is for Kane to bury this." The contractors outside were adapting to the situation's realities. Instead of frontal assault, they were setting up crossfire positions, using their disabled vehicles as cover, preparing to pin down the diner's occupants with sustained fire while a separate team attempted entry. It was sound tactics, the kind of maneuver that worked when you had numerical superiority and your opponents were trapped inside a structure with limited exits. But the shepherds weren't trapped. They were positioned, and there was a difference. Reyes had been waiting for the contractors to commit to their new formation, and when they did, he made his move. The propane tank behind the diner was still connected despite Dax's earlier work, and Reyes had spent 30 minutes running a remote ignition line from the tank to his position. He triggered it now, and the tank exploded with a roar that shook the ground, sending a fireball 50 feet into the air. The explosion wasn't directed at the contractors, it was deliberately vented away from occupied positions, but the psychological effect was immediate. Men who'd thought they were conducting a simple extraction operation suddenly found themselves in a combat zone where their targets had explosives and the willingness to use them. The contractors broke, some running for their vehicles, despite the flat tires, others taking cover behind the gas station across the street, all of them reassessing whether their contract was worth dying for. In the sudden lull, Griff heard sirens approaching from multiple directions, and relief washed through him like cold water. They'd held. Against 20 professional operators with superior equipment and tactics, 5 bikers and 2 women had held a diner for 37 minutes. The first sheriff's cruiser arrived with lights blazing, followed by 3 more, and then a Texas Ranger unit with 2 stone-faced men who looked like they'd been born wearing Stetsons. The contractors were still armed, still in tactical positions, but now they were surrounded by law enforcement with clear authority and no confusion about jurisdiction. The situation was transforming from combat operation to crime scene, and everyone present could feel the shift. A voice called out from across the street, amplified by a bullhorn. "This is Texas Ranger Captain Rodriguez. All armed individuals, drop your weapons and show your hands. This area is now under state authority." The contractors hesitated, looking at each other, waiting for instructions that weren't coming. Their radio communications had gone silent, which suggested that whoever had been coordinating them had decided discretion was preferable to being connected to a failed operation. After 30 seconds of tense standoff, weapons started hitting the pavement. One by one, the contractors complied, their hands rising in surrender gestures that looked awkward on men trained to be aggressors. Then the sound came, low at first like distant thunder, but growing. Not thunder, engines, dozens of them. Marcus moved to the window, his expression transforming from tension to disbelief. "Mother of God. Highway 66 had become a river of chrome and leather. Motorcycles stretched as far as Griff could see, in both directions, headlights creating a chain of light that looked almost biblical. 50 bikes, 100, more still coming. They weren't riding fast, just steady and inevitable, converging on Redstone from every compass point. The contractors who just surrendered looked up, their faces showing the first real fear Griff had seen. Texas Rangers stepped back instinctively, hands near weapons, but not drawing, everyone processing what was approaching. The first wave of bikers pulled into the diner's parking lot, engines cutting one by one. The lead rider was late 60s, gray beard down to his chest, wearing a cut that said Veterans MC, Korean War Chapter. He dismounted with the stiff movements of age and walked straight toward Captain Rodriguez with the confidence of someone who'd earned the right to fear nothing. Name's Bull Morrison, his voice carried across the silence like a pronouncement. Rode with the 1st Marines in Korea back when we knew who the enemy was. Heard on the CB that some boys needed backup against federal overreach. Seems we got here just in time. More bikers dismounted. Banditos Christian riders, independent clubs from 4 states. Old men and young men, veterans and volunteers united by the simple principle that sometimes you had to stand up. They didn't draw weapons, didn't need to. 200 men in leather standing shoulder to shoulder created a wall that was more psychological than physical. Bull walked to Ruby's shattered front door. You the shepherds we are. Griff met him at the threshold. Then you got some sheep that need watching. Bull's grin was missing several teeth. These government always want to get to that girl, they go through all of us first. Captain Rodriguez's jaw was tight, but he was professional enough to recognize when a situation had shifted beyond his control. He approached Bull with careful respect. Sir, I appreciate the solidarity, but this is an active law enforcement scene. I need to ask your people to stand back. My people will stand exactly where they are. Bull's voice didn't rise, but everyone heard the steel underneath. Until we're satisfied that girl in there that is going to be protected proper. Not by contractors pretending to be FBI, not by agencies with agendas, but by people who answer to the law and the Constitution. She's under Texas Ranger protection as of now. Rodriguez held Bull's gaze. You have my word. Your word's good. Bull nodded slowly, but we'll stick around to make sure it stays that way. Inside the diner, the shepherds maintained their positions even as the immediate threat dissolved. Griff knew better than to assume safety just because official authority had arrived on. Kane was deputy director of CIA, which meant he had resources and connections that wouldn't disappear just because one assault had failed. The microfilm was still in play. Lyra was still a target, and the next 72 hours would determine whether evidence reached the right people or disappeared into the bureaucratic void where inconvenient truths went to die. The next 2 hours involved so many statements, interviews, and official documentation that Griff lost track of who was asking questions and who was recording answers. Federal marshals arrived from San Antonio with protective custody orders for Lyra signed by a federal judge at Captain Holland's request. FBI agents from the actual San Antonio field office arrived and immediately arrested the contractors, charging them with impersonating federal officers, assault, and conspiracy. Texas Rangers secured the diner as a crime scene, collecting shell casings and documenting damage. Through it all, the shepherds stayed together, refusing to be separated for individual questioning, insisting on their right to counsel, even though none of them were being charged with crimes. Marcus's law enforcement background gave them credibility, and the fact that they'd been defending against unlawful assault rather than initiating violence gave them legal protection. Texas self-defense statutes were clear. You could use force, including deadly force, to protect yourself and others from unlawful attack. The shepherds had used minimal necessary force, aimed their weapons strategically rather than lethally, and documented everything through 911 calls and CB radio transmissions. By dawn, the immediate threat had passed. The contractors were in custody, facing federal charges that would keep them away from Lyra indefinitely. The microfilm had been secured by Senate Intelligence Committee investigators who'd arrived on a military helicopter before sunrise. Lyra herself was surrounded by federal marshals who took their protective custody orders seriously, treating her with professional courtesy rather than the hostility she'd experienced from Kane's people. Ruby surveyed her diner in the gray morning light, taking in the blown doors, shattered windows, and bullet holes that decorated the walls like some kind of violent art installation. Her insurance would cover the damage the Rangers had assured her, and the state of Texas would compensate her for lost business. But Griff could see in her eyes that she was calculating different costs, the kind that didn't show up on insurance forms. "You boys brought war to my establishment." She spoke without anger, just statement of fact. "In 30 years of running this place, I've seen fights and crimes and every kind of human foolishness, but nobody ever used explosives before." "Ma'am, I apologize." Griff meant it. "We never intended to put you in danger." "I didn't say I was complaining." Ruby's smile was tired but genuine. "That girl needed protecting, and you five were the only ones willing to stand up. That means something, and that means this diner served its purpose." The federal marshals took Lyra to a secure location in San Antonio, and she went without protest but with backward glances at the shepherds who'd defended her. Griff wanted to say something meaningful, some reassurance that her father's sacrifice wouldn't be wasted, but the words caught in his throat. Sometimes protection was enough. Sometimes you didn't need poetry. "We'll testify." He settled for practicality. "Whatever hearings happen, whatever investigations, we'll tell the truth about what Kane tried to do." Lyra nodded, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "Thank you for everything, for believing me when nobody else would." Then she was gone, surrounded by marshals and official authority, disappearing into the system that would either protect her or consume her, depending on how congressional politics played out. Griff watched the vehicles leave and felt the familiar emptiness that came after adrenaline faded, the letdown that soldiers knew too well. Bull Morrison stayed behind after most of the other bikers had dispersed. He stood with Griff in the parking lot, watching the sun climb higher, two men separated by decades but united by understanding. "Your shepherds did good work here." Bull lit a cigarette with fingers that trembled slightly from age. "Reminded me why I still ride. Not for the road, for moments like this. Appreciate the backup." Griff accepted the cigarette Bull offered. "Didn't expect 200 bikers to show up. CB Network works fast when it matters." Bull exhaled smoke that caught the morning light. "Every club from here to Oklahoma heard your call. Most of us are too old for this shit, but some things you don't age out of. Protecting people, standing up, being the wall between the innocent and the wolves. That's what we try to do. Then keep doing it." Bull clapped him on the shoulder. "World needs more shepherds, fewer wolves. You boys figure out how to multiply yourselves. You let me know. I'll help spread the word." After Bull left, the shepherds stayed in Redstone for another week while investigations proceeded and statements were verified. Captain Rodriguez requested they remain available for follow-up questions, and none of them minded the delay. Ruby's diner needed repairs, and the five of them had construction skills. It felt right to rebuild what had been damaged in the defense. They worked through August heat, replacing doors and windows, patching walls, restoring the diner to something approaching its former condition. Local residents stopped by to watch and occasionally to help, and gradually the shepherds learned that Redstone had decided they were heroes rather than troublemakers. Vincent Hale Sr. tried to stir up opposition, claiming the bikers had brought violence to a peaceful town, but his influence had collapsed along with his son's credibility. Vince Jr. was facing assault charges that Ruby had finally agreed to file, and the Hale family's grip on local politics was loosening. On the 8th day, a government car arrived carrying Captain James Holland, who turned out to be exactly what Reyes had described. Army intelligence officer, turned congressional staffer, sharp-eyed and professional, carrying himself with the authority of someone who'd spent years navigating Washington bureaucracy. He met with the shepherds at Ruby's diner, now restored enough to serve coffee and brief them on developments they wouldn't see on the news. Deputy Director Kane has been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Holland spoke quietly, aware that even in a small-town diner, walls had ears. The Senate Intelligence Committee has opened formal inquiry into CIA black operations on domestic soil, with particular focus on the Volkov matter. Your testimony will be crucial. Will Lyra be safe? Griff asked the question that had been eating at him. Or will Kane's people try again? She's in protective custody with marshals who don't answer to CIA. Holland's expression was carefully neutral. And Kane's assets are being systematically identified and neutralized. The contractors you fought were just the visible layer. There's a whole network of people on CIA payroll who do things that never show up in official records. We're dismantling it piece by piece. What about the weapon? Marcus leaned forward. The particle beam technology. Is it real? It's real. Holland's voice carried weight. Volkov was a genius. His design is theoretically sound and practically achievable. If either America or the Soviets build it, the strategic balance changes permanently. So what happens now, that's being decided by people several pay grades above me. Holland smiled without humor. But there's talk of joint development, technology sharing agreements, using Volkov's work as basis for arms control rather than arms race. Reagan and Gorbachev have been looking for ways to de-escalate Cold War tensions. This might be the catalyst. The conversation continued for another hour, covering legal implications and testimony schedules, and the kind of bureaucratic details that made Griff's head hurt. When Holland finally left promising to keep them informed, the shepherds sat in silence and processed what they learned. They'd stumbled into something that would be written about in history books, assuming the truth ever became public. They'd defended a woman against their own government's shadow operations and somehow lived to tell about it. But they also learned something darker. On the 10th day, Sheriff Tom Briggs requested a private meeting with Marcus. The two lawmen sat in Briggs's office for an hour, and when Marcus returned to the shepherds, his face was gray. Briggs confessed. Marcus's voice was hollow. Kane had leverage on him. Something from his OSS days, classified operations that could still put him in prison. Kane used that to make Briggs cooperate, look the other way, provide intel on local law enforcement response times. So he was compromised. Griff felt anger mixing with pity. That's why he played it so careful with Vince Jr.'s arrest. He says he hated every minute of it. Marcus sat heavily. But he's retiring effective immediately. Can't be sheriff when he can't trust himself to do the job right. He wanted us to know he's sorry. For what it's worth something, Coda spoke quietly. Takes courage to admit you were compromised. More courage than most people have. Doesn't change what he did. Dax's voice was hard. Doesn't change that he enabled Kane's network. No, it doesn't. Griff stood looking at each of them. But it reminds us that good people make bad choices when they're scared or threatened or backed into corners. Our job isn't to judge them. Our job is to make sure there are fewer corners that people get backed into. 3 months later, in November 1985, Griff received 2 letters. The first was from Lyra. She'd been relocated to the Washington, D.C. area, given new identity and job with a defense contractor that was legitimate rather than corrupt, and was slowly rebuilding her life under the protection of people who took their responsibilities seriously. She thanked the shepherds again, her words simple but heartfelt, and included a photograph of herself standing in front of the Capitol building, smiling genuinely for the first time since they'd met her. The second letter was from the White House. President Reagan was honoring American citizens who'd performed extraordinary service, and the Iron Shepherds were on the list. The ceremony would be in May 1986, formal attire requested but not required, and families were welcome. The photograph from Lyra went up on the wall behind Ruby's counter, next to other pictures of local heroes and community members. Ruby had created a small memorial section for the Shepherds documenting their defense of her diner with newspaper clippings and official commendations. The Iron Shepherds Motorcycle Club had become part of Redstone history, but legends weren't sustainable and the Shepherds knew their work wasn't finished. They stayed in Redstone through the winter, helping with other local problems, small-scale interventions that didn't make headlines, but mattered to the people involved. They mediated a property dispute between ranchers, helped a veteran's widow navigate VA benefits, stopped a domestic violence situation before it escalated to tragedy. The work was endless because human need was endless, but it was work worth doing. By spring of 1986, they were ready to ride again. Redstone had healed, Lyra was safe, and the road was calling with that particular siren song that only bikers understood. They said goodbye to Ruby, who'd become something like a mother to all of them, and promised to return whenever Redstone needed them. The morning they left, half the town came out to see them off. Children waved from sidewalks. Veterans saluted. Ruby stood in front of her rebuilt diner with tears in her eyes and pride in her bearing. The Iron Shepherds mounted their motorcycles and rode south on Highway 66 toward whatever came next. May 1987 arrived with the ceremony at the White House. They rode their motorcycles to Washington, D.C., a journey of 1,400 miles that took 5 days and attracted attention at every stop. By the time they arrived at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, they'd been interviewed by 3 newspapers and 2 television stations, all asking the same questions about who they were and what they did. The ceremony itself was brief and formal. Reagan shaking each man's hand and presenting them with presidential citizens' medals, while photographers captured the moment. But afterward, in a private reception, Reagan pulled Griff aside for a conversation that lasted 5 minutes and changed everything. "I know what you boys did in Texas." The president's voice was quiet, meant only for Griff's ears. "Holland briefed me personally. You stood up to elements within my own government that had forgotten who they serve. That takes courage most people don't have. We did what needed doing, sir. That's the right answer." Reagan's smile was grandfatherly, the same expression that had won him elections and diffused international tensions. "This country needs more people like you, people who understand that service doesn't end when you take off the uniform, people who protect others not because it's profitable, but because it's right." Griff didn't know how to respond to that, so he just nodded. Reagan clapped him on the shoulder and moved on to other guests, but the words stayed with Griff long after the ceremony ended. "Service doesn't end when you take off the uniform." It was true in a way he'd never been able to articulate, and hearing it from the president gave it weight. The Shepherds left Washington that evening and rode west away from power and politics, back toward the open spaces where they felt most comfortable. They stopped in Redstone for the night because it felt like coming home, and Ruby fed them meatloaf that tasted exactly like it had 2 years earlier. The diner was thriving now, busier than it had been before the siege because people wanted to eat where heroes had fought. Ruby had embraced the attention, adding historic site to her sign, but she'd kept the corner booth reserved for the Shepherds, and that mattered more than any official recognition. That night, sitting around a campfire outside town, Griff told the others about Reagan's words. They listened in silence, each man processing the implications in his own way. Finally, Dax spoke up. "So we keep riding, keep helping, keep being the people who show up when nobody else will, until we can't anymore." Marcus looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from a decade of hard work. "We're not getting younger. At some point, someone else will need to do this. Then we teach them." Reyes was already thinking strategically, his intelligence training engaged. "We document what we've learned, create protocols, train the next generation. The Iron Shepherds become a legacy instead of just 5 guys." The conversation continued late into the night, plans forming and evolving dreams of something larger than themselves. They'd started as 5 veterans looking for purpose and found it in protection. Now they could pass that purpose to others, create a network of people dedicated to standing up when standing up mattered. 2 years passed in a blur of roads and towns and people who needed help. The Shepherds developed a reputation that spread through veterans networks and law enforcement communities, becoming the people you called when official channels failed or moved too slowly. They helped a whistleblower escape corporate retaliation in Oklahoma, protected a witness in a corruption case in New Mexico, stopped a militia from attacking a Native American reservation in Arizona. Every intervention was different, but the core mission remained constant: stand between the vulnerable and those who would harm them. In the summer of 1989, reality forced changes they'd been avoiding. Marcus's knee gave out during a confrontation in Amarillo, torn meniscus that required surgery and 3 months of recovery. Dax broke his hand on someone's jaw in Lubbock, the bones not healing as fast as they used to. Even Griff felt it, the accumulation of injuries, in years, the body's quiet insistence that 42 was different from 38. They gathered at Ruby's diner in October, all 5 of them nursing various aches, and had the conversation they had been postponing. The work hadn't stopped. The calls for help kept coming, but their ability to respond was changing, and ignoring that reality would get someone killed eventually. "We need to expand." Griff laid it out simply. "Recruit people we trust, train them properly, create regional chapters. The Iron Shepherds can't just be 5 middle-aged guys on motorcycles anymore." The vote was unanimous. By November, they'd begun reaching out to veterans they'd worked with over the years, people who'd shown both competence and character. By December, the first training session was held in San Antonio, 15 people learning everything the Shepherds had figured out through trial and error. By the following spring, 200 trained volunteers were answering calls for help across Texas and 3 neighboring states. The network grew organically, spreading through word of mouth and shared values rather than advertising or recruitment campaigns. Veterans MC chapters provided infrastructure and communication networks. Church groups offered funding and community connections. Law enforcement officers who'd worked with the Shepherds became liaisons, helping navigate legal complexities and jurisdictional issues. Griff rode less after that, spent more time teaching than doing. But every few months, when a call came in that needed the original five, they still mounted their bikes and rode together. Some oaths didn't expire. Some commitments lasted until you couldn't honor them anymore. September 11, 2001 started like any other Tuesday. Griff was in his garage in San Antonio, 64 years old, and still riding, still answering calls. The television was background noise until it wasn't. Until the second plane hit. Until the world shifted on its axis and everyone understood that safety was an illusion. His phone rang. Not the club phone, the private number only 4 people had. "You watching Dax's?" voice was tight. "Yeah." "We ride." Griff looked at the shovel-head chrome still gleaming after 4 decades of road. Looked at his hands scarred and arthritic but still capable. Looked at the wall where Lyra's photograph hung next to dozens of others, people they'd protected. Lives they'd changed, evidence that 5 men on motorcycles had mattered. "We ride." 2 hours later, the Iron Shepherds gathered at Ruby's diner. Ruby herself had passed in 1998, but her daughter ran the place, now kept the corner booth reserved, maintained the memorial to that August night in 1985. The 5 of them sat exactly where they'd sat 16 years ago, older and slower, but no less committed. World needs shepherds again. Marcus spoke what everyone was thinking. Different enemy, same mission. We're too old for this. Coda's protest was an automatic ritual. We should be training the next generation, not still doing the work ourselves. Then we do both. Reyes smiled. We ride one more time. Show them how it's done. Then we teach them to carry it forward. They rode out at dawn on September 12th, 5 old men on older motorcycles heading toward New York, because that's where people needed help. They didn't make it all the way. Law enforcement turned them back at Pennsylvania, but they helped in the places they could reach. Refugee centers, blood banks, churches, organizing relief efforts. The work had changed, but the purpose remained constant. When they finally returned to Texas in October, Griff called a meeting. Not just the 5 of them, but everyone they'd trained over the years. 40 people in a VFW hall, veterans and volunteers, men and women who'd learned that protection was a calling, not a career. Time to make this official. Griff stood at the front, feeling every one of his 64 years. The Iron Shepherds can't just be 5 guys anymore. We build a network. We create chapters. We train people in every state to do what we've done. Stand up, show up, protect those who fall through the cracks. The vote was unanimous. By November, the Iron Shepherds Network had been incorporated as a nonprofit. By December, they had chapters forming in 12 states. By the following spring, 200 trained volunteers were answering calls for help, carrying forward a mission that had started 20 years earlier with 5 veterans who didn't know how to quit. Griff rode less after that, spent more time teaching than doing. But every few months, when a call came in that needed experience more than youth, he still mounted his shovel head and felt the wind and remembered why he'd started this journey. 2005 brought the final ride for the original 5. Coda's heart gave him a warning at 60, and the doctors were clear: no more stress, no more physical confrontations, time to accept that age had limitations. The others weren't far behind. Marcus's knee was bone on bone. Dax's hearing was going from too many explosions. Reyes had developed tremors in his hands. Griff's back hurt every morning and most nights. They met one last time at Ruby's diner, now run by Ruby's granddaughter, still maintaining the corner booth and the memorial. They ordered meatloaf and coffee and sat in companionable silence, 5 old men who'd done what they could with what they had. 22 years. Dax finally spoke. Not bad for 5 guys who didn't know what they were doing. We knew enough. Marcus smiled. We knew to show up. That's 90% of it. The network's stronger than we are. Reyes traced patterns on the table with his finger. 300 active volunteers across 15 states. They'll carry it forward, but it won't be the same. Coda's voice was gentle. Every generation does things differently. That's good. Griff looked at each of them, these men who'd become closer than brothers, who'd stood with him through everything. If it stayed the same, it would die. Better that it evolves. Better that younger people make it their own. They ate their meatloaf, drank their coffee, talked about old times and good fights and people they'd helped. When it was time to leave, they stood together in the parking lot where 5 motorcycles were parked for the last time as a complete set. No speeches. Marcus's eyes were wet. We all know what this means. Yeah, Griff embraced each man in turn. We do. They rode out separately, each heading toward his own home and his own future. Griff was the last to leave, sitting on his shovelhead in the parking lot, watching the sunset over Route 66. He thought about Sarah, whose death had started this whole journey. He thought about Lyra, whose protection had shown them what they were capable of. He thought about all the people they'd helped, all the fights they'd won, all the times they'd stood between the vulnerable and the wolves. The road stretched ahead one last time. Griff kick-started the shovelhead, felt the familiar rumble, and rode west towards San Antonio and whatever came after riding. Behind him, the sun painted the sky in colors that looked like fire and hope, and the Iron Shepherd's network continued its work, younger hands carrying forward a mission that would outlast any one generation. Some things were worth protecting, and some people were willing to do the protecting. When those two truths intersected, that's when the darkness retreated 1 mile at a time. The shovelhead's engine roared one last time, and Griffin Maddox rode into the sunset, a shepherd coming home.